I recreated Cookie Clicker in just 48 hours, and this is how. This is Cookie Clicker, a game about clicking this cookie to get more cookies. It's pretty self-explanatory, so I decided to create my own version of it, but to keep it interesting, I decided to give myself 48 hours to recreate the basic mechanics of Cookie Clicker, and I'd say I did a pretty good job. The first thing I had to do was decide what engine to use, and I decided to use Game Maker Studio 2. I created a new project and called it Donut Clicker. Now, this isn't my first Donut Clicker rodeo, as I used to do a lot of programming on Scratch, the block-based programming engine, which is how I got into programming. And if you don't have a clue on how to program, I would say it's a great starting point. It gives you tons of sprites and backgrounds to use, and it's pretty easy to use, although don't expect to become a master program on it alone. You'll have to learn other languages eventually, but it's still a great starting point. But back to Donut Clicker, the first thing that I did was make the sprite for the donut. It looks bad, but that's just temporary. It'll look better later in development. Trust me. I then created two objects, Donut and Manager, with Donut being what the game revolves around, you clicking it, but Manager being much more important as it deals with most of the code and variables in the game. Sure, I could just put that stuff into Donut and call it a day, but this makes it a lot easier. I then created a .ini file, which is used to write and read saved data. I did this now so that I wouldn't have to hodgepodge it in later, which I've had to do for a few projects before, and that is not very easy to do. And I made it so it automatically saves data when the game is closed, and now you can click the donut to gain donuts. Although it took me a while to figure out I needed the donut object on screen for it to properly work. I then created a simple background for the donut counter for it to look nice. It took a bit of time, but in the end I feel it turned out pretty good, and I then did my first list attempt out of many that ended up failing spectacularly, with me just giving up and making the text smaller. Next, I started working on what would take up the vast majority of this project, the shop. You can buy two things, buildings and upgrades. Now, they're not overly complex like they are in Cookie Clicker, but I only had 48 hours to make this. Autel has had a decade. Cut me some slack. Now, deciding what buildings to include took a while, but I eventually landed on clickers as the first building. The rest were decided later, so I'll get to them in due time. But now it's time to design how you buy the buildings. Not like this. This buy button stuck around far longer than it had any right to. It was small, sure it looked fine, but it failed at showing any number larger than 10,000, which is most of the numbers in the game. I also accidentally deleted the entire button, which made me redo the design of something that wasn't even going to be used at all in the final game. Excellent time management skills from me. I also imported this, a basic alphabet that I use in most of my projects. It's nothing special, but it's useful for when Game Maker's text option isn't very great up close. And I am now 1 hour into this project. Yeah, that took me an hour, and depending on who you are, that's either impressive or horrible. But keep in mind, I had to create most of the sprites and all of the code from scratch, and I've only used Game Maker on and off for about 10 months at this point, so I'm not experienced as other devs might be. I then turned the building list into an object so I could make it scroll. It's a bit slow and scrolls the wrong way, but it's progressing. I also made it so that it doesn't scroll too far up or down, which is pretty important. And it's now time to create the rest of the buildings that you can buy. The next one I decided on was a semi-reference to Cookie Clicker, which has JavaScript frameworks, game makers. And the final building tier, unless I decide to add more to this game later on. We also came to the realization that you shouldn't have pixel perfect letters at any size above 10. Then, after a lot of thinking, I came up with the rest of the buildings. Bakery for tier 2, schools for tier 3, power plants for tier 4, websites for tier 5, GPUs for tier 6, and cookies, yet another more obvious reference to Cookie Clicker, for tier 7. I then designed little pictures for each of them, which I think turned out pretty well, and added in the code that lets you buy them, although currently there's a special buy none get one free, although I didn't have enough time to fix that though because I had to go to work, which means it's... So I'm about 18 hours into this project, and I have work again from 3 to 7, so I'll miss out on a good few hours of development. First, I removed the buy none get one free discount, so when you click on something, you actually buy it. I then had some issues with this stupid thing, and realized I should probably replace it with something good, but first I needed to create a debug key which just resets all values to 0, it's not that important. And this is when I had my second realization about how bad these stupid things were, and after spending too much time trying to make them work, I decided to see how it was done in Cookie Clicker myself, and that just made sense, so I made the shop list wider, fixed the names so that they appear nicely with the prices beneath them, and changed the buy button to be a blank rectangle, meaning I can just press that instead of these stupid buttons. Although these were a bit finicky to get working, they worked so much better and just worked, especially with writing the required text for them. Next, I added a simple animation that just made the donut do a little bounce when clicked to make it more obvious that you clicked the donut instead of it just staying there and not reacting like the monster that it is. And now it's starting to come together a bit, not perfect by any means, but it's playable and that's what's important. I then added a display counter for how many donuts per second are being earned and arranged the menus a bit so that everything fit in there nicely, and I also changed it from round to floor. Round takes it from its current number and takes it to whichever number is closer, whereas floor removes the decimal places, which makes it much more accurate when purchasing the items. And now, after about 3.5 hours of coding, I finally started working on the upgrades. First, I designed a small box and then created 8. One for each type of upgrade, along with one more to act as a parent object so that I don't have to rewrite the same code 8 different times. I also had to shrink the logos to about half the size of what they were, which turned out pretty alright after some light touch-ups. Then began the tedious task of coding in upgrades, something that took up a good few hours of work. First, I made it so that when you press the button, it doubles the donuts per second of the respective building, which allowed for crazy numbers to be earned in a stupidly short amount of time. I then added that to all of them, and the sky's the limit. I then made that not the case by limiting it to only 64 times, meaning that the clicker, for example, has a max of 6.4 donuts per second, although if I do decide to expand upon this game later down the line, which I can, and as you'll see later, I might increase it to 128 times or even 256 times. Only time will tell. And here's the current version. Each upgrade only costs 2,000 donuts and the price goes up exponentially. Very cool. Here I just made it so you don't accidentally buy a building when buying an upgrade. A pretty simple fix, but still useful. And now we've got the best space saving thing in this project. It shortens the length down, so instead of 1000, it only says 1k, which saves a pretty small amount of space now, but when it gets into the millions and billions, it's a lot more. I also changed it from being 2 to the power of upgrades to 1.5, drastically reducing the amount, but it's not the only time that I'll change the exponentials around. I just won't comment on it again. And after doing some light changes to make it show amounts closer to what it is by doing one for 10k and 100k with different lengths, I ran into an issue. There wasn't enough space for the full number to be displayed. And this was the most annoying issue. You see, how numbers work in GameMaker is that there are two types, real and integer. Integers are all positive whole numbers, and real numbers are any number that is real. So it includes decimals, and for some reason, when displaying real numbers, GameMaker decides to have it set to 2 decimal places, which is too many to fit in this little box. So what did I do? First, another terrible array attempt. Then I landed on the amazing idea of making the area bigger. A brilliant idea that it wasn't enough, so I had another horrible attempt at using arrays. Then I made the game area itself bigger, giving me so much more room for activities, and finally enough space to fit all the building upgrade tiles. I also changed the size of the buy buildings tab to allow more buildings to be added later. And now it's time for prestige levels and ascension, the bane of my existence. Here I'm just adding in the code to make the game save the prestige amounts so you don't lose them when you close the game, and these are the sprites for the bar, one simple black background bar and one light blue bar that shows the progress to the next prestige level. Then I just have to write in the code that makes the bar move and the code that resets the prestige meter when it reaches the goal, and there we have it, the basics of prestige meter. It reaches the end and resets, adding 1 to the prestige count. Next, I decided to take a short break by adding a way to make buying upgrades more powerful by multiplying the donuts per click by each upgrade, meaning if you got all the upgrades, you would earn 64 to the power of 8 donuts per click, or 284,479,710,656 donuts per click, which was enough to nearly crash the game. I'm being serious here, this is playing at 2 times speed and it barely survived. So I changed it to make it so each one gave me 1 additional donut per times multiplier per click, meaning if the first upgrade gave 1 more, the second upgrade gave 2, the third gave 4, and so on. This made the game actually balanced. Who would have known? And to finish off the second day, I finally decided to redesign the terrible donut that I made when I started this challenge, and I think this one looks a lot better than the original design, although it took a fair amount of time to get looking just right. And now it's the final day, and I have about 3.5 hours to finish this game. Luckily, all that's left is finishing the prestige system and the game is done. First I added the button that gives you prestige. I made a simple black outline button and added text to make it obvious what the button does. Then made the button pressable and added in code to increase the number of donuts earned per prestige level, along with resetting the prestige progress when the button is pressed. After some testing and light bug fixing, I decided to work on the rest of the Ascension mechanic, starting off with creating a second room for Ascension where you can pick your upgrades. Now it's time for the Ascension upgrades. There are 4 different ones available that you can choose from, each with its own benefits and a fit that you unlock after buying the other 4 upgrades. First we have Chocolate, a fairly simple upgrade that increases your donuts per click by 25%. Meaning when you start off, instead of getting 1 donut, you get 1.25 donuts, a pretty decent upgrade if you ask me. Here I'm just coming up with the general look for it. The second upgrade there is Cinnamon. Similar to Chocolate, it boosts your donuts per click by 5% of the donuts per second, meaning if you have 100 donuts per second, you get an additional 5 donuts per click. And this does stack with both Chocolate and the final upgrade, so you can get up to 15% of the donuts per second from 1 click. The third upgrade is Caramel, which makes all buildings 10% cheaper, meaning instead of 15 cookies for your first cursor, it's only 14. It doesn't save a huge amount in the early game, but in the late game it gets very useful. And the fourth upgrade is Strawberry. Similar to Caramel, it decreases costs. This time it makes all upgrades 10% cheaper, meaning the first tier of cursors is only 900 donuts instead of 1000. This one also comes in handy late game, but is also much more useful in the early game. And this is the donut circle, although currently Ascension is purgatory, so I need to make a small button that will bring you back to the mortal realm to make more donuts. Next I need to make the donut upgrades themselves, which means creating another parent event and writing code to make sure that the sprinkles are only buyable once all other upgrades have been bought. Originally that took 4 separate if statements, but I was able to narrow it down to just 1. I then started work on the benefits of Chocolate and Cinnamon, which didn't work out perfectly, so I ended up having to change the variable location to Manager in order to make it work properly. Then I started to work on some text that will show the number of donuts gained from each click, and here we we have my final terrible attempt at using arrays before admitting defeat and creating an object that says the number of donuts earned, a much easier and better way of getting this to work properly. Now we're getting close to the end. I have about 1.5 hours left and just need to add in a few finishing touches, and this should be pretty easy. First, I made it so that when you have the corresponding upgrades, the donut you click reflects that by changing the quarter of the upgrade that you just bought, which I got in pretty quickly. I then upgraded the code of the upgrades to make them keep their state when the game is closed, meaning that you're not forced to buy them every time you close and reopen the game. And I finally got around to adding the save data for the upgrades, meaning the end of the save data list coming in at 25 items. I then changed the code up so it makes you work for the prestige points instead of getting one for every 100 donuts, and I started work on the background for the prestige screen. I just got a dark blue background, opened my auto clicker, and just moved my mouse around, creating this simple background image for it. Nothing special, but I feel it looks pretty nice all things considered. Now all that's left are some simple text boxes that tell people what they'll get when they buy the upgrade. I settled on a pretty basic white box with a black border design and came up with a simple description for each upgrade, which ended up pretty well considering I did this in about 10 minutes. I added in the separate text box for sprinkles, which only appears once you've bought all the other upgrades, wrote some code that makes the count work properly so I don't need to save another variable, and rewrote the chocolate description to be less tacky, along with writing an actual description for the rest of the upgrades instead of just copying what was written in chocolate. Now all that's left to do is make the rest of the upgrades work, which consisted of about 5 total lines being added to the code. Then I wrote some code that I should have written about a day ago that makes sure that the upgrades appear on top of the text that the buy boxes make, and now the game is pretty much done. Now, as much as you can say the game is finished, it really isn't. It's missing the built-in display here, it doesn't have the cursor wheel that Cookie Clicker has, and it's also missing something that I wanted to add, which is falling donuts in the background, similar to what Cookie Clicker does. But I still feel like the game is somewhat complete, and who knows, if this video gets enough support from you guys, I might even make another video where I improve it to include those features, along with potentially changing some elements up. But that's all for this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, along with telling me in the comments if there are any games you'd like to see me poorly make in 48 hours, and I'll see you later.